Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Vivek Venkatesh, the Dean of the Faculty of Education at McGill University, a James McGill Professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education, the UNESCO Co-Chair in the Prevention of Radicalisation and Violent Extremism since 2017, a filmmaker, musician, curator, and an applied learning scientist who works on community resilience and pluralism. That's quite the portfolio, Vivek. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to engage with you.
So I hear you're a big fan of death metal music. Is that correct?
I am. I like a lot of types of music. Death metal I'm particularly fond of. I have very specific tastes when it comes to extreme metal music. I really like Swedish death metal, coming out from a specific studio in Stockholm called Sunlight Studios. And I'm also very fond of some of the Florida and California early death metal from the 80s and 90s.
Am I right to assume that extreme metal music, as you worded it, is an integral part of your research identity?
That's a good question. Is it an integral part of my research identity? I would say it is. And you know, I would agree, because I think that when I made the decision to pivot my research towards investigating cultural scenes, communal aspects of cultural scenes, consumption of various types of art that addressed, let's say, the darker components of our lives, extreme metal seemed to be a context which I believed I would have had some embeddedness. And so, being a metal fan myself, having been ensconced in extreme metal scenes in the various countries that I had lived in, it gave me, I think, a special perspective on it. But it is part of my research identity. It's not the only thing that comes to mind now, but you're right. I would say between 2012 and 2016 to 2017, I was firmly ensconced in working on what is now known as metal music studies.
Very interesting. Could you please tell us a little more about your research interests? Like, why do you do what you do?
Yeah, sure. I think it's important to kind of just take a step back and think through why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then I think I'll be able to explain better why I'm passionate about the research that I conduct. As you pointed out in your introduction, I hold a UNESCO chair in the Prevention of Radicalisation and Violent Extremism. And this is held across 4 different shareholders. I work closely with David Morin, who's a political scientist at University of Sherbrooke, Marie-Ève Carignan, who is a media and communication scholar also at Sherbrooke, Haida Hassan, who is a clinical psychologist at Université du Québec à Montréal, and myself. I began this career as a UNESCO co-chair from Concordia University, where I worked before joining McGill. But I was working mainly in public policy and pedagogy. My interest in this research is strongly grounded in a path towards pluralism. I'm very interested in seeking both conventional and unconventional paths towards pluralism. And I look at pluralism within a pedagogical lens. So I'm interested in seeing how we can create spaces for dialogue that we can characterize as pluralistic. Dialogues which take time to unfold and which follow certain reflexive, certain exclusive ways of thinking and knowing. And so that's where I think it's important for me to be able to work across a variety of disciplines.
So you do this through pedagogy. So you research pedagogy and how pedagogy could make room for pluralism through different modalities?
Yeah, I do. I research pedagogy, and I research it in a variety of contexts. I'm interested in both formal and informal learning contexts, but I'm also very interested in the ways we can leverage arts-based pedagogies and arts education, both in classrooms, but also in disruptive ways within society. So my research, while it began when I was working in this field, very, severe qualitative tendencies, and looking carefully at how we might be able to build through inductive content analyses specific theory on, let's say, consumption of dystopia, ways in which the dark arts actually allow us to reflect on some of the more somber aspects of postmodern society. I began to then feed these theory into my creative work. And that's where I began to work and create films, documentaries, so both feature films as well as documentaries, and also a whole series of artistic projects. And most of those, in fact, have as their mission to be able to create spaces for dialogue and promote this notion of discomfort that I've been developing theoretically for a while now. How discomfort is, I think, a key axis of social forms of pedagogy, and how we can build in and promote a transparency towards shame as an ethic of dissent. What happens when we dissent with other people, and in what ways can we actually leverage this very tacit notion of shame in our lives to create an ethic for dissent. So that's how I'm framing this. I'm purposefully trying to be as fluid about this because the project itself develops as the creative undertakings interact with the theory that I'm developing.
That's interesting. And what would the end goal be ultimately? Is there an end goal?
That's such a good question. I haven't really thought about this as an end goal for a couple of reasons. One is that I had very positivist training in my own graduate work. I'm a statistician by training. And so when I began my career as a professor in the broad field of education and specifically educational technology, I had developed an expertise in quantitative ways of thinking and knowing and positivist reifications of that kind of work. So, experimental and quasi-experimental studies, which look specifically at how manipulating specific variables in a classroom context would lead to different outcomes. And I think that work is really important. And I know that learning scientists and whole hosts of scholars in the field that revolve around the learning sciences are doing some excellent work in that regard. I didn't have the passion and the commitment to leverage those public monies that I was getting for this work, and in thinking about how they might be adapted for public good. And so I undertook this exercise of pivoting my work towards more peace education, civic education, and this notion of pluralism. But one of the things that really helped me is to not think about an end goal. I wanted to figure out what is the process of thinking about pluralism. What are some of the personal things that's happened to me that impact how I have taken on this work. So that's kind of one of the major reasons in doing so, in not thinking about a goal. The second reason I would say is that the majority of the creative work that I've undertaken, which builds on the theoretical work which I work on individually, it's collaborative. So creative work is completely collaborative. I submit, to a certain extent, the theories that I've developed to the collective of artists that I work with. And they tend to, modulate and interpret and take things apart and say, here's how this theory of the banal, which I'm working on now, can be reified in terms of music or in terms of an installation or in terms of a documentary film. And that's actually very liberating because I submit, to a certain extent, to an interpretation of the work, which is deeply personal to me, and then it becomes a way for us to be able to embody that specific concept. So it's a constant interaction. I don't know where it's going to lead next, and often I'm trying to think carefully about what's my role as a creator or as an artist, and how is that going to influence what I'm writing about next. But I feel very privileged, in fact, to be able to fund and to be able to work with a collective of artists who respect this procedure of bringing their creative elements to bear on the theory that I have developed.
So before we talk about history, I just have one more question to ask you. Could you tell us a little more about the pathways that led you to your research?
I think if I were to pinpoint one specific act, one specific event that marked the way I think about myself as a as a professional. So whether that is as an administrator now, if I'm seen as a dean, if as a theorist, if people are reading the philosophical essays that I'm writing, or as an artist, if there's one event, then I would have to trace that back to June 23, 1985. It was a day that was very sad for me because I lost a cousin in a terrorist attack. And so his name was Sukumar Chandrasekhar, and Sukumar was, I was very close to him because what Sukumar actually introduced me to, I was a very precocious young boy. He introduced me to reading for pleasure. So, introduced me to various authors, Enid Blyton mostly, and then there's a whole host of other novelists that he introduced me to, and kind of said to me, like, you're a bright guy doing well in school, but you really need to develop yourself beyond scholastics. And I remember that really clearly. And when he died in the terrorist attack, I was just so distraught because it felt like such a random act. It just felt like this is designed to terrorize. It's designed to destabilize. And I felt all the more shaken by it, and in a sense, cognitively shaken. I was dissonant in a certain sense because the group that committed the terrorist act were extremist Sikhs. And a few months before, about 6 months or so before Sukumar died, I was living in New Delhi in India, and I was witness to the riots in New Delhi that lasted for weeks and weeks after the assassination of our Prime Minister at that time, Indira Gandhi. So she was assassinated by her bodyguards who were extremist Sikhs themselves. And so on the streets of New Delhi, vivid memories I have of Sikh men being lynched, being killed by mobs, because any apparent similarity to the group of people that had committed that act was taken as a reference point for committing murder. And my grandfather and uncle, I remember, would hide Sikh men in our home. They would shave their beards and hair. The Sikh religion asks for men to grow out their hair and beards. They would shave them off for them so they wouldn't be recognized on the street. And I felt, as a youth, as a young boy, after Sukumar died, I felt like, how is it that this group of people cannot have the same sense of humanity that my family had, for example? It's a very narrow viewpoint, right? And I think I thought of it was part of my subconscious for a long time. It was a really interesting way for me to get to know my father, because Sukumar came to me from my father's side as my cousin. So he was very close to my father as well. And, it was one of the few things that my father opened up to me about in terms of his own epistemic orientations towards emotions like hate. And so when I decided to build this framework around pluralism, I think what I was trying to do was contend with these very harsh emotions that for a long time I would suppress. I would develop very xenophobic attitudes towards the other. And I realized it's because I had not really had an opportunity to seek out the help, whether it was mental health therapy, whether it was psychological help. If your question is to probe my intent for the research I do, there is a very, very humanist intent towards it. What I've learned as well after engaging in this work for a while now, it's been, upwards of 10 years that I've engaged in this larger orientation towards peace education through these projects on pluralism. What I've learned as well is to really remain humble in the outcomes, in the way the outcomes are perceived or how they are picked up by community partners. In the academe, we tend to favor the individual and the success of the individual over a broader collective notion of our responsibility as educators, as researchers in achieving humanist goals. And so the humility that comes with working in this field, I think, needs to be engendered in realizing when you take a step back, when you stop, in fact, directing these activities. Since joining McGill, and even before I had made the decision to move from Concordia to McGill, I had already begun to turn the volume down on a lot of my projects because I felt I was repeating myself. And you really need to have a way to hand off the infrastructure, the monies, the capacity to bring those monies to our institutions to a different group of people. We have to learn to build sustainable leadership in this work. Otherwise, you just end up kind of reifying and becoming the phenomenon that you are investigating. that's something that I shy away from, and I push back against it vehemently.
Thank you for sharing such a sad but yet uplifting story. Not only about the death of your cousin, but also the lessons of humanity that you learned from your family and your parents. So in a way, you're applying the lessons that your father taught you. And I also like how you say the outcomes should be in the hands of the people you're working with, and you're giving them the voice, the space. So I really appreciate that. So now let's talk history. All right.
That's what I'm here for.
All right, history. So, what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history?
I would say a book. That's the first idea or image. And I would actually put the two of those constructs together, the idea of a book, but also the image of a book. I can't really figure out what the title of the book is. I know that it's dark brown leather. I know that it has a thick spine. And I know that it's kind of got dog ears as well, something that has been consulted for a while. To be honest with you, one of the first books that I purchased with my own money after earning when I was giving private tuition classes when I was young, is a compendium of Arthur Conan Doyle stories, outside of what he had written with the Sherlock Holmes collection. So I was interested in Conan Doyle as a writer. And he has, a series of stories which involve boxing and very gritty stories around prostitution in modern England. So there's that image, of a thick book that's bound comes to mind. But for me, history has this ethereal connotation, and that's the image and the idea that comes to mind. And it's kind of like a floating book. It's just floating in the air, waiting to be picked up.
Very interesting. So with that image of the book, and you talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and his stories, would that be your earliest memory of your connection to history?
I would say that yes. I can also explain why. I think there's a certain objectification and even a certain romanticization of history. We've talked about this when we've had personal conversations, but I come from a deeply colonial upbringing. I was born in New Delhi in India, and I grew up around the world, whether it was in South America and Venezuela or the United States. But I moved back to India to do most of my middle and high schooling, I would say. And when I say it's deeply colonial, I'm referring specifically to the fact that my mother tongue is English. I spoke in English when I was young with my family. We obviously spoke a variety of Indian languages because when you inhabit different states in India, there are local languages which have their own scripts that you learn in school. But English was very much the language that we spoke at home. Very educated family, over several generations. And also people who had worked, in my family, people had worked with the government and in government service. My grandfather held a very high administrative role in the city of Pondicherry in southern India, which was a French conclave. And so French was my second language. I learned French in school in India as a second language as well. So there's a multiple flavor of colonialism that comes into the way I think about history. I think about the Conan Doyle book as being one of the first times I said, okay, this is mine to hold and cherish, but it also opens up a whole world of what British colonialism looks like in Britain, right? There's an aspiration, so to speak, of wanting to visit to a certain extent, but also wanting to inhabit that area. So yes, it becomes real through these stories, and you can taste the food and you can smell the pubs and you can feel the intensity of the boxing matches that are described. And that reification of life through the book is, for me, very, very significant as a historical standpoint.
It's interesting. So it's like an anchor or a marker in time.
For sure. And very grounded in education, right? That's the other piece. I mean, I'm choosing to objectify and feel solace and feel pleasure in subsuming this as part of my colonial identity, right? And just for the record, it has, it's not very easy to talk about this in an era where the words colonialism and decolonialism have a different context in Canada, for example, right? My celebration, for example, of my identity is not something that can be framed in a pithy way during a conversation. It really needs to have I think, like you're asking to do, a reflexive and a reflective element, but also a suggestion that, we have multiple truths where we reside and things don't necessarily have to mesh.
You seem to wear it well. So.
I hope so, yeah.
All right. So could you describe an incident or a moment in time where you had to justify the importance of using history to attain a goal or to attain some kind of positive change, either through your personal life or through your work?
Yes, I can actually. One of the projects that I worked on in my role as UNESCO co-chair of prevention of radicalization and violent extremism focused on life narratives of former right-wing extremists in Canada. So I worked very closely with Ryan Scrivens, who at that time was my first postdoctoral fellow. He's a criminologist by training, and he was really adept and very interested in working across his discipline and my own, as an educator, an art educator, working with a criminologist on tracing life narratives of former extremists. I think the two of us brought a different flavor, not just to the ways in which we collected the data and worked through the interview process, but also in terms of how we've subsequently analyzed those data. Working with Ryan was a great apprenticeship for me in terms of learning about a different social science discipline. And one of the key elements of the work that we engaged in was anchoring our project in the history of the peoples who we were leveraging for our project. One of the things that's so problematic with these types of methodologies is acknowledging some of the extractive nature of the work that happens, right? These are people who are very vulnerable, who have undergone incarceration because they have run afoul of the law. Each and every one of the 10 people we spoke to were attempting to or had successfully reintegrated into society, but the scars of their experiences in these right-wing movements in Canada, some of which, some people had been in the movement for more than a couple of decades, others for just a few months. So we really looked at a variety of data points, so to speak. One of the key things we had to be mindful about is situating the history and the histories of each of these individuals in terms of understanding what brought them to the point where they decided to submit themselves and be recruited into these extremist movements. The histories of their childhoods were the ones that captivated me the most. Ryan was very skilled in working with them slowly and carefully. Sometimes these interviews took weeks to complete with one single person. You'd need to give some time to reflect, get back to them at another time. Sometimes too many wounds were opened and they would need to step away or say, I can't participate anymore. But the histories of their childhoods was so important for us to understand the impact of family and community and the role of family and community in prevention of radicalization to violent extremism. We couldn't have done this unless we had asked specifically, what was your family life like? To a person, I remember looking at these data, the interviews and the transcripts, to a person, we had learned that many a time these former extremists would feel ashamed talking about their recruitment into these movements. They were scared that they were going to get scolded by their parents. So the fright of being reprimanded, of being scolded, or maybe even physical abuse because they were interested in these extremist movements prevented them from actually benefiting from a family environment where they might have been told, hey, you're doing something wrong. This is not acceptable. Let's try and correct this. Now, one could argue, well, that's an easy out. It's easy in hindsight to say, well, my family could have done more to help me out, right? And that argument is, I think, very valid. So as researchers, we have to find different ways of eking out, all right, let's think about, what was it like at school? Were the teachers open to you making errors in judgment? It kept coming up, historically and specifically in childhood. I wasn't allowed to make mistakes. Came up quite a bit, and if I'd made a mistake, I was punished for it, and I didn't want to be punished, so I just didn't let on that I was making mistakes, and I began to consort with and be part of a larger group where my viewpoints were mirrored in other people's viewpoints, and it just gets magnified, right? Like in a silo, you just kind of keep going, oh yeah, I'm right, and you're saying I'm right, so let's just continue operating in this way. There was nobody there to actually tell them, this is wrong. So for me, the fact that we were able to situate that work historically in their childhoods also gave us a window into, we never did this in our work, but it gave me a window into developmental psychology, thinking carefully about in what ways can we actually harness research, leverage research about developmental psych? How can we build trust amongst youth, especially youth who are prone to make mistakes and errors in judgment, and yet allow for those errors in judgment to prevail, so that the consequences of those actions aren't as negative as they currently might be. I don't know, it's a tough question, but it also shows that this can't be solved through a public safety approach or by solely a social service approach or solely educational or solely mental health. I think there needs to be a concerted interdisciplinary effort around it.
That's interesting. So you're saying that there's a lot of social pressure on youth to conform to a certain standard, and if they were to ever make a mistake or err, they're too scared of the circumstances or the consequences that they don't speak to anyone or they don't get the help that they need.
What happened to making mistakes?
Yeah.
And
it's wrong to make a mistake.
Yeah, what happened to making mistakes and learning from them? And part of it, I think you can blame a much richer and a much more connected social media environment in which everything that you do gets magnified. Whether you like it or not, you may not be on social media, but you are being filmed, for example, in an extreme way. Thinking about surveillance, right, is also important. So people tend to hide their nature or hide things that they think might be politically incorrect from others. It's interesting conversations I have with my own children who are young adults now and who've grown up in an era of social media. Both of them have very, very, very sparse traces of their lives online, because they said they don't want to jeopardize anything that they might want to do in the future because of youthful indiscretions.
So those patterns are being repeated.
Yep.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Very interesting.
This is just anecdotal. I'm talking about two people who've confided in me,
but I've seen that. I've seen that among other young people. So it's very interesting. So just to get back to the data you were looking at, so you talked about what got them into violent extremism, but did they share their life stories or moments of their life stories where they talk about how they got out?
They do, actually. There's another really interesting point. So Ryan and I and the entire team that we had put together decided to work on different outputs for this, academic outputs. So, some papers focused on the role of the internet in facilitating recruitment into violent extremist movements. Others looked at, the role of family. Others looked specifically at disengagement and how it differed from, let's say, de-radicalization. When you disengage from something, does it mean that you're completely de-radicalized? What does de-radicalization mean? So they did talk about moving out. The most poignant stories there were connected to what we would consider to be humanist notions of wanting to be part of a collective or a family. Some people were in extremist movements. They met, their life partners or spouses and had children. And then, as they're raising their child, they realize, my goodness, I can't believe that I'm in a movement and that the ideology that I aspire to is something that this young life is going to aspire to as well. I don't want to impart that to them. That leads some people to say, I need to get out of the movement. Others see humanity amongst people who they are taught to hate and have hated for very long, and they see a humanist orientation that they bring to bear on them. There's a story about a person who, a right-wing extremist who was hurt, very seriously hurt, because of a battle, a fist fight, a knife fight that they engaged in. And they wake up in the hospital and see a Jewish doctor wearing a kippah helping them out and stitching them up and, saving their life. And a few conversations happened, but for that person, it just exploded in their mind that, my goodness, what am I doing here? I am taught to hate this person, and he's here, helping me out. And he obviously can see all the tattoos, the insignia, everything anti-Semitic that he's that he's representing himself with, signifying himself with. So those are, I think, important narratives to bring to bear. I think that they're important as well in terms of how people reflect. I think history and historical ways of thinking and knowing allow us to reflect. I'm constantly surprised at how people do not take the time to reflect before responding, because reflection actually allows you to engage with your past or connect with an experience you've had and say, is there a way for me to be compassionate about the way I'm going to react about this instead of antagonistic about it?
I just want to get back to the point you talked about, people don't reflect. So I really appreciate that, because that takes us to my next question. So based on what you've said, what do you think history is? What is history? And what does it serve to do?
So I'm approaching this, purely as an academic in the social sciences. I think a lot of it as a humanist and as an artist. I think history needs to have a complex and a multifaceted definition for us to be able to leverage it in terms of our own pedagogical practices to start with. So let me explain myself. I think on the one hand, one could argue that history needs to be an objective retelling of the facts. And regardless of the kind of disinformation, misinformation, or malinformation age in which we are living, or a post-truth society, apparently, that we are experiencing, I think we need to have a collation of objective recounting of events. I think that's really important, and I think history provides a frame for it. On the other hand, I think what history allows us to do is to operate in an analytical way and provide different lenses. And some of these lenses are going to have, let's say, cultural orientations. Others are going to have economic. Others will have social. Others will have political. And we can bring in to bear different orientations to think carefully about what might have caused these events to happen. And I will admit that this is a very neoliberal, maybe even positivist way of looking at a definition of history. Here are, let's say, an objective series of events. Let's agree on the sequence, for example. Let's agree on the actual fact versus fiction elements of it. But then let's also allow for a group of people to come in with different frameworks, with different perspectives and lenses, different disciplinary orientations, to allow us to unpack, like, how did this happen? Why might it have happened? And what does this have to show in terms of where we're at right now? In recounting this, I'm thinking of this in a fairly sequential way. I kind of have a sequence of events that lead to where we are in present day. From a social scientist, that's how I see history. But, if I upend that and I think about, how I frame history as an artist, I work with music quite a bit, and I work with different forms of music. I have a couple of outfits in which I play improvised music, and another one in which we actually compose and we rehearse. And the frame is much more rigid and strict in this newer outfit, which is called Banal, as opposed to some of my other projects like Landscape of Hate or Halka, where pretty much with gay abandon, we're in a space, we have a certain artistic liberty that we take. History in that particular context actually frames how the art is created. I feel, in a certain sense, liberated in an improvised band because I don't really care what I've done in the past, and I don't really care what is going to happen in the future. I'm very much making things in the moment. And yes, I acknowledge I'm influenced by the things that we've done before, and I'm maybe thinking about in the back of my mind, all right, what happens the next time we work on this? It's improv, we're never going to repeat ourselves. But in the more structured work that I've done in my newer outfit, we're constantly pushing ourselves to create this, I find, unattainable form of pop music. And part of doing that is submitting ourselves to the drone of a rehearsal, the mundanity of it, pushing back against some of the orientations towards commercialization of music and saying, if we want to disrupt our can we disrupt from within? And in that particular case, I have to remember what happened in the previous rehearsals. I have to remember why the song sounds the way it does. What are the historical elements that are influencing what we do? And that becomes a very different kind of definition of history, which enables me to think creatively in at least two different outlets.
The latter sounds more stressful than when you're in the moment and just doing your thing.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I want to encourage myself to and push boundaries that I've set for myself, especially now. And, we're so privileged in these musical endeavors to not have to submit ourselves to the vagaries of commercialization and record sales and the like. This really is a very integral part of the research and creation that we undertake, that I undertake specifically, but that we undertake as a collective. So putting that privilege very much at the center of how I compose as an artist, I think it's really important to acknowledge that I'm pushing certain boundaries and subjecting myself to that stress, as you put it.
It's very interesting. You talked about history as being done at the individual level, and you talked a little bit about the collective level. Is there a difference? Maybe we could start with your band, and because you're working together in sync. So maybe when you are in the moment, you are being yourself in an individual state of happiness, like the bliss of just playing and not. You are like the happy cows, like Nietzsche would say, they're eating the grass and not chained or burdened by memories of the past. But when you're in the group playing music together, there's another dynamic that seems to happen, and that's where you have to think of the sequence, the structure.
Yeah.
Could we extend that, or am I putting words in your mouth?
Not at all. No, I really like how you're forcing me to rethink or analyze my own reflections here. I think you're right. There is a certain sense that a collective submission to an ideal or the attainment of an ideal is a really interesting way to look at how we, as a band, for example, pick up on what we've practiced, pick up on the historical nature of what we've done. That's I think important. And if I frame it, if I kind of take a policy orientation, so if I'm thinking of it as a pedagogue or as a policymaker, I think what I would like to see in terms of a collective form of history is to a certain extent what I'm seeing also in the current email threads that we are getting from our colleagues in our Department of Integrated Studies and Education, which on the one hand can be full of anguish, because the things that we're discussing are concerned with war and with crises and with death and with dispossession and of very, very vulnerable communities in specific parts of the world, but also broadly. And what does history teach us when we are engaging in those discussions? And what does it mean for us to have multiple viewpoints and multiple truths that are brought to bear in these discussions? I think what history allows us to do, if you'll permit me here, is, and I'll just kind of engage in metaphors, which I know are going to break down eventually, but what history allows us to do as a collective is to actually walk between our spaces of memory. So, each of us, you and I and our colleagues in the department, have different memories and different histories and different analyses of these histories that we bring to bear when we either contribute to a discussion or even if we're reading it. Because, when I go through these threads, I imagine people reading this, but not responding. Not everyone responds, but I imagine people reading it. And, I may be making a serious assumption in that everybody is reading and then kind of just sitting back, reflecting, thinking about where they're positioned with it, thinking about, should I respond, should I not? If I don't respond, what does that mean? Or reading a response and going, oh, I'm glad that came up because that's how I'm thinking about this issue. So a collective history there, I think, allows us to remain murky. And that's what's really interesting. Collective histories actually allow us to see beyond our own identities and our own experiences. And we submit to them without actually realizing that we're submitting to them. I think we make conscious decisions to say, no, I don't agree with this point of view. We may not write it out, but we'll say it to ourselves, or we'll knock on somebody's door who we know agrees with us and say, oh my God, did you read that? I can't believe it was said. And the other guy goes, yes, I can't believe it. It was awful. I'm totally in agreement with you. I'm glad that, I don't have to respond to it. All of that, I think, is really important as a politic of history. So if I can kind of frame this to end the answer to your question, I think the history of thinking through things collectively allows us the space to be uncomfortable, allows us the space to actually roam in between our ways of thinking and knowing, and be unstable about what we know and not know, be unsafe, as Eamon Callan calls it, intellectually unsafe about what we know and don't know, and at the same time find solace amongst our acolytes. I think it's important for us to go back and, get a hug from someone who we know agrees with us, because it's terrible to feel that you are alone in how you're thinking about a very serious humanistic issue. And our roles as pedagogues, our roles as teacher educators, as curriculum specialists, as philosophers of education, we have to count on our colleagues and our friends in the industry to actually pat us on the back when we need it. So that's, I think, the role of collective history.
I think it's beautiful. I really like the way you word it. The history is walking in between the spaces of memory, or roaming around in between the murkiness. I really like that. I think there's something to reflect on. So based on what you've said so far, is history a good thing? Or is it a bad thing?
If I was forced to choose between the two, I think it's the best thing. I would say it trumps everything else. It demonstrates the bias on my part in terms of how I think about history. I think of history as being as an essential part of reflection. I mean, you can't reflect without history, and you can't reflect without the objective nature of what we remember from history, but also the subjective ways in which it impacts what we are thinking and what we do. So I think it's the best part of human ways of thinking and knowing. And I'm not coming to that because I reflected on it before. I'm coming to that from this conversation, because I know that it certainly impacts the ways in which I respond to criticism, the ways in which I respond to plaudits, and everything in between. I reflect and I'm really careful. I'm careful because I think nobody can protect you better than yourself. But in doing so, I think you're also protecting the people with whom you're having a conversation. Right? That is care beyond self-care. And history allows us to think beyond self-care.
Vivek Venkatesh, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Paul.